I caught my wife with her lover, and she smirked, "You're not a man enough to stop us." I replied, "I wish you both well," and left. The next morning, she's panicking. I showed them what it meant to be a man in an unexpected way. Hello. Thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel to help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. It would be great if you can also comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout-out in our next story. Today, our special shout-out goes to Grace Griffin from South Carolina. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's dive into the details of today's story. The key slid into the lock with a soft click, and I stepped into the house, our house, my shoes scuffing against the polished hardwood I'd spent a weekend sanding myself 6 years back. The air smelled faintly of Lydia's lavender candles, the ones she lit when she wanted to pretend everything was fine. I set my briefcase down by the door, the leather creaking under my grip, and loosened my tie. 3 days in Chicago, shaking hands with suits who thought they could outsmart me, and all I wanted was a glass of bourbon and the quiet hum of home. Funny how you build a life expecting it to wait for you. The flight had landed early, 6:42 p.m., ahead of schedule, a rarity these days. I hadn't texted Lydia. No point. She'd be buried in her phone anyway, scrolling through whatever glittering nonsense Derek had posted online that day. I'd seen his type before, all flash, no substance, a peacock strutting for anyone who'd look. I'd let her have her little obsession, thinking it'd burn out. That's what I told myself, at least, as I peeled off my coat and hung it on the rack, the metal hooks gleaming under the foyer light. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Muffled, sharp, a laugh, high and careless, spilling down from upstairs like a spilled drink. My fingers froze on the coat sleeve. Lydia's voice followed, softer, tangled in a tone I hadn't heard from her in months, maybe years. A man's low chuckle wove through it, cocky and unhurried. My chest tightened, but my face stayed still. I've spent a lifetime perfecting that mask. You don't get where I am, Mark K. Holdings, the name behind half the startups in this city, without learning to hide the storm inside. I took the stairs slow, deliberate, each step a quiet thud against the carpet. The laughter grew clearer, bouncing off the walls of the home I'd paid off before I turned 35. My hand grazed the banister, cool and smooth, grounding me as I climbed. The bedroom door was cracked open, just an inch, but enough for the light to spill out, a sliver of gold cutting through the dim hall. I pushed it wider with 2 fingers, the hinges silent, and there they were. Lydia, my wife of 8 years, her dark hair spilling over the pillows, our pillows, her bare shoulders catching the lamplight. And Derek, sprawled beside her, shirtless, his chest puffed out like he'd won something. The sheets were a mess, tangled around them, and the air reeked of sweat and arrogance. Her eyes flicked to me first, wide with shock, her mouth opening to spit out some half-baked excuse. "Mark, I didn't," she started, but I wasn't listening. My gaze locked on Derek, his smirk spreading like oil on water. "You're not man enough to stop us," he said, voice dripping with venom, each word a jab meant to draw blood. He propped himself up on one elbow, daring me to swing, to scream, to do anything but stand there. Lydia's hands clutched the sheet to her chest, her face a mix of panic and defiance, waiting for me to crack. I didn't. I adjusted my glasses, slow, methodical, the frames cool against my fingertips, and let the silence stretch. The room felt smaller, the air thick with their expectation. I could have smashed his face into the headboard, could have torn the house apart with my bare hands. But that's not who I am. Not anymore. I've learned there's power in holding back, in letting them think they've got you figured out. So I looked at them. Really looked. Her flushed cheeks, his smug grin, the wreckage of a life I'd built, and I spoke. "I wish you both well," I said, my voice steady as granite, every syllable clipped and final. Derek's laugh barked out, sharp and ugly, like he'd expected a fight and got a surrender instead. Lydia's brow furrowed, doubt flickering in her eyes for the first time. She thought she knew me, thought I'd shatter, beg, or storm off in a rage. She was wrong. I turned on my heel, the carpet swallowing my footsteps, and walked back down those stairs. My briefcase was still by the door, waiting like an old friend. I picked it up, slung my coat over my arm, and stepped into the night. The air outside hit me like a slap, crisp, February cold biting through my shirt. The streetlights buzzed faintly, casting long shadows across the lawn I'd mowed 100 times. I didn't look back. Not once. The drive to the hotel was a blur, headlights streaking past, the hum of the engine filling the silence. I picked the Marriott downtown, the one with the high windows and the bar that never asks questions. Checked in under my name. No alias, no fuss. The clerk handed me a keycard with a practiced smile, and I rode the elevator to the 12th floor, the numbers ticking up like a countdown. Room 1208 was all beige walls and stiff sheets, the kind of place that feels like nowhere. I dropped my briefcase on the desk, poured a bourbon from the minibar. Neat. No ice. And crossed to the window. The city sprawled out below me, a lattice of lights blinking against the dark, alive and oblivious. I took a sip, the burn sliding down my throat, warming the cold knot in my gut. They thought I'd broken. Lydia, with her quick excuses, probably figured I'd slink off to lick my wounds. Derek, that swaggering fool, likely saw me as a coward, a man too weak to claim what's his. They didn't know me, not the real me. Not the man who'd turned a single stock trade into an empire, who'd buried enemies in boardrooms without raising his voice. They didn't see the gears already turning, the plan snapping into place behind my calm eyes. I set the glass down, the base clinking against the wood, and leaned my forehead against the cool glass of the window. My reflection stared back, unshaken, unreadable, a man carved from stone. Let them laugh. Let them think they'd won. I'd spent a year funding Derek's little dream, watching him strut around with my money, waiting for this exact moment. Tonight wasn't the end. It was the spark. Tomorrow, I'd light the match. The hotel room smelled of stale coffee and bleach when I woke up, the kind of sterile scent that clings to places built for strangers. Sunlight sliced through the blinds, sharp and thin, cutting across the desk where my empty bourbon glass sat like a sentry from the night before. I didn't sleep much. Didn't need to. My mind was already spinning, gears clicking into place, mapping out the day like a chessboard. I dreamed of Lydia once, years ago, her laugh bright and real. Last night, all I saw was Derek's smirk, and it didn't haunt me, it fueled me. I showered quick, the water scalding, steam clouding the mirror until I wiped it clear with my palm. My reflection looked back, gray at the temples, lines around my eyes, a man who'd learned to bury his rage deep. I dressed sharp, a charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, no tie. Today wasn't about show, it was about execution. My phone buzzed as I knotted my shoes, Lydia's name flashing on the screen. A text. Mark, I'm sorry. Can we talk? I let it sit there, unanswered, a little ghost of her guilt flickering out in the void. She didn't mean it. She never did. By 8:15, I was in the hotel's conference room, a box of glass and steel, all sharp angles and cold light. My lawyer, Evelyn, was already there, her briefcase open, papers fanned out like a dealer's deck. She's a shark in heels, gray hair pulled tight, eyes that could cut glass. You sure about this, Mark? She asked, tapping a pen against the table, the rhythm steady as a metronome. I nodded, sliding into the chair across from her. Never been sure. She didn't push, didn't need to. She'd seen me dismantle bigger fish than Derek. The papers were simple. A single signature to pull every dime of MK Holdings out of Derek's startup, Connect Sphere. $1 million funneled through shell accounts over the past year, propping up his big talk and bigger lies. I'd funded it blind. No meetings, no handshakes, just a ghost in the machine, watching him preen. Evelyn slid the document over, and I signed it slow, the pen scratched loud in the quiet room. Done, she said, snapping her briefcase shut. They'll feel it by noon. I leaned back, the chair creaking under me, and let a small, tight smile slip. Noon sounded perfect. Flashback to 6 months ago. Lydia coming home late, perfume clinging to her like a lie. Work ran over, she'd said, avoiding my eyes. I didn't buy it. I started digging, quiet, methodical. Her phone left unlocked one night showed texts from D, flirty, bold, dropping hints about his game-changer startup. I knew the name, Derek Grayson, a loudmouth I'd met at a tech mixer, all teeth and bravado. I traced the threads, found his pitch deck in my inbox from a year back, buried under junk. That's when I decided, give him the rope, see if he'd hang himself. He did, and he dragged her with him. Back in the present, I left Evelyn with a nod and stepped into the hotel lobby, the buzz of morning chatter washing over me. My phone stayed silent. No more texts from Lydia. Good. Let her stew. I grabbed a coffee from the barista, black and bitter, and watched the city wake up outside the glass doors. Cars honking, people rushing, oblivious to the bomb I'd just lit. Meanwhile, across town, Lydia was waking up in Derek's bed, smug as a cat with cream. I can picture it, her stretching under his cheap sheets, smirking at the ceiling, thinking she'd slipped her leash. She'd always wanted more thrill, more shine than I gave her. I built her a fortress. She wanted a carnival. Derek was sprawled beside her, probably still shirtless, his voice booming as he bragged about his latest pitch. We're locking in Series B next week, he'd say, tossing his phone in the air like a kid with a toy. Big players, babe. They're eating out of my hand. She'd laugh, feeding his ego, blind to the cliff they were dancing on. I sipped my coffee, the heat searing my tongue, and checked my watch. 10:47. Less than an hour now. I wondered what she'd say when it hit, how she'd twist it in her head to make me the villain. She'd never see the truth. I didn't start this fire. I just poured the gas. At 11:53, I was back in my room, briefcase open, reviewing a new deal clean energy out of Boston, no baggage. My phone rang, an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, but curiosity tugged. I played it. Derek's voice, tight and high, a far cry from his swagger. Hey, this is Derek Grayson from ConnectSphere. We've got a problem, our investors pulling out. I need to talk to someone at MK Holdings, like, now. Call me back. I deleted it, the beep cutting through the silence. Let him squirm. By noon, it was done. Evelyn texted. Funds recalled. Lawyers notified his team. I pictured the scene, Derek's phone ringing again, his assistant pale-faced, stammering about the bank. What do you mean? Gone? He'd snap, pacing that glass-walled office I'd paid for. Lydia would be there, probably, sipping his overpriced espresso, watching his kingdom shake. Then it'd happen, his first crack. This is your fault, he'd hiss at her, voice sharp enough to cut. You distracted me last night, kept me up with your damn drama. She'd blink, stunned, the first splinter in her fairy tale. I stood at the window again, coffee cooling in my hand, the city sprawling below like a map I'd already conquered. They thought they'd broken me last night, thought I'd slink off, tail between my legs. But I'd been building this moment for months, laying the trap they'd walked into blind. Derek's startup was a house of cards, and I'd just pulled the bottom one free. Lydia wanted freedom? She'd get it. Raw and ugly, stripped of everything I'd given her. The storm was coming, and I'd be the eye of it. I've always liked the sound of glass. How it hums when you tap it just right, how it shatters when you push too hard. Derek's office was all glass when I saw it last, a year ago. Gleaming walls, sleek desks, a temple to his ego built with my money. I bet it didn't sound so pretty now, not with the storm I'd unleashed. Noon had come and gone. The funds yanked like a rug from under his feet, and I could almost hear the cracks spreading, his empire splintering, piece by fragile piece. I was still at the Marriott, sitting in that beige room with my coffee gone cold, when I pictured it. Derek pacing those glass halls, his voice bouncing off the walls like a trapped animal. ConnectSphere's office was a startup cliché, open plan, trendy, buzzing with interns who thought they were changing the world. I'd funded it all. The overpriced chairs, the neon sign with his logo, the coffee machine that cost more than their rent. Now, it'd be a madhouse. Phones ringing off the hook, creditors barking demands, staff slipping out the back with their laptops under their arms. I leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking under me, and let the scene play out in my head. Derek would have gotten the call by now. His CFO, some kid with a finance degree and a nervous stutter, breaking the news. The money's gone, Derek. MK Holdings pulled out, every cent. They said, personal misalignment. I could see his face, that smug grin twisting into something uglier, his hands slamming down on a desk littered with Red Bull cans and crumpled pitch notes. What the hell does that mean? He'd yell, voice cracking, the first bead of sweat sliding down his neck. His team would scatter, unpaid interns grabbing their coats, coders texting their next gig, the receptionist already on Indeed. Chaos, pure and loud, swallowing his dreams whole. I'd set this in motion a year ago, almost to the day. Flashback to that tech mixer downtown, a rooftop bar with too many lights and too much noise. Derek was there, all teeth and swagger, working the room like he owned it. I'd been sipping a bourbon, watching the crowd, when he sauntered up. "Mark, right? Finance guy," he'd said, clapping my shoulder like we were pals. I nodded, let him talk about his vision, his app that'd redefine connection. Garbage, but catchy garbage. I pitched him the startup idea right there, offhand, casual, a seed I planted to see what'd grow. "Sounds like a winner," I'd said, slipping him my card. "Send me a deck." He did. I funded it. Not because I believed in him, because I wanted to test her. Lydia had been there that night, too, hanging on my arm until Derek started his spiel. I saw the spark in her eyes, the way she leaned in when he talked, laughing too loud at his dumb jokes. I didn't miss it. I never miss anything. She took the bait, and I let her run with it. Late nights, work drinks, his name dropping into our dinners like a stone. I gave him the rope, funded his circus, waited to see how far they'd climb before they fell. Now they had, and the crash was deafening. Back in Derek's office, reality was biting hard. I could imagine Lydia there, perched on some over-designed couch, sipping his artisanal coffee while he unraveled. She'd called my office by now, I knew it. My assistant, Claire, would have picked up, her voice cool and clipped. "Mr. Keller's unavailable. Can I take a message?" Lydia wouldn't leave one. She'd hang up, frustrated, that seed of doubt from last night sprouting into something sharper. She'd start digging, because that's who she was, too proud to beg, too stubborn to let it go. I stood and crossed to the hotel window, the city humming below, a gray February sky pressing down. My phone buzzed. Claire's number. She called. Her text read. Sounded off. Asked if you were in today. I didn't reply. Let her chase shadows. I'd made myself a ghost, untouchable, while Derek's world burned. In that glass cage of his, the cracks were spreading fast. A tech blog, TechPulse, maybe, had caught wind by 1 p.m. I tipped them off through a burner email weeks ago, just in case. Connect sphere crumbles. Mystery investor pulls plug. The headline would scream, and the comments would pile up, vultures circling a corpse. Derek's bravado would fade then, his voice shrinking as he barked at his team to fix this. But there was no fixing it. The lease was due, the payroll was dry, and his charm couldn't pay the bills. I'd counted on that. His whole game was smoke and mirrors, and I just turned on the fan. Lydia would feel it, too, the shift, the air going sour. She'd watch him pace, his swagger melting into desperation, and start to wonder. She wasn't dumb, not by a long shot. She'd piece it together. Eke Holdings. The initials would nag at her, tugging at some memory she couldn't place. Then it'd hit. I could see her now, standing in that chaos, digging through her phone, scrolling old emails, frantic, interns shoving past her with cardboard boxes. She'd find it, an email from me, months back, buried in her inbox. Subject, dinner tonight? Signed, Mark K. Holdings. Her breath would catch, her fingers freezing on the screen as my name stared back. That was the moment, the key moment, when the ground shifted under her. Not guilt, not yet. Defiance would come first, her jaw tightening as she told herself I was the bad guy, the puppet master pulling strings. She'd cling to that, because admitting she'd been played, by me, by Derek, by her own hunger, would crack her wide open. I knew her too well. She'd storm out of that office, heels clicking on the tile, determined to confront me, to prove she wasn't the fool. I turned from the window, grabbed my coat, and headed for the door. The hotel room felt smaller now, the walls closing in with the weight of what I'd done. Not regret, satisfaction, cold and clean. Derek's kingdom was ash, his staff gone, his creditors circling like wolves. Lydia was waking up, but too late. I'd pitched him that idea a year ago, a lure glittering in the dark, and they'd both bitten hard. Now the hook was set, and I was reeling it in. The elevator dinged as I stepped inside, the doors sliding shut with a soft hiss. I adjusted my glasses, my reflection sharp in the steel, and let the faintest smile tug at my lips. The dominoes were falling, loud and fast, and I'd placed every one. Evening settled over the city like a bruise, heavy and dark, the kind of night that makes you feel the weight of every choice you've ever made. I wasn't there to see it, not in that crumbling bubble Lydia and Derek had built, but I could feel it, taste it, the way you know a storm's coming before the first drop falls. They were drowning now, the water rising fast, and I was the one who'd opened the floodgates. I sat in a new city, Pittsburgh, maybe, or Cleveland. Doesn't matter, hundreds of miles from their mess, a glass of whiskey in my hand, the amber catching the dim light of a bar I'd never been to before. The burn of it was smooth, steady, a quiet reward for a game well played. Back there, in the wreckage of Derek's apartment, the air would have been thick with panic by now. I could see Lydia standing in that cramped space, peeling paint, cheap furniture, a far cry from the glass palace of his office, her arms crossed tight, her voice sharp as she finally turned on him. What the hell happened? Derek? She'd demand, her tone slicing through the haze of his excuses. She'd found my email by then, Mark K. Holdings, and the truth was clawing its way up her throat. His startup, his big talk, his whole damn life, it was all a house of cards, and I'd been the one holding it up. Now it was flat, and she was starting to see the cracks. Derek would have been pacing, shirt untucked, hair a mess, that cocky grin long gone. I'd seen him unravel once before. At a pitch meeting he didn't know I'd crashed, sweating, fumbling, a kid playing dress-up in a man's world. Now, with the walls closing in, he'd lash out. It's not my fault. He'd snap, voice breaking, pointing a shaky finger at her. You think I wanted this? The loans piled up, okay? The demos, half of them didn't work, but they bought it anyway. She'd blink, stunned, as he kept going, desperation spilling out like vomit. And yeah, there's someone else, some chick in marketing, so what? You're not exactly innocent, babe. That had hit her like a slap, his confession a jagged edge tearing through her fantasy. I took a sip of whiskey, the ice clinking soft against the glass, and let the scene unfold in my mind. Lydia would have realized it then, traded me, steady and sure, for a fraud who couldn't even keep his lies straight. She'd storm out, heels pounding the chipped linoleum, leaving him shouting after her, "Where you going? You need me." But she didn't. Not anymore. She'd head straight for her house, she'd still call it, convinced she could claw back some control. Funny how she thought she still had a move left. The bar stool creaked under me as I shifted, pulling a folder from my briefcase, clean energy startup, Boston-based, numbers that sang on the page. I flipped through it, pen in hand, circling projections while the bartender wiped down the counter, oblivious to the war I just won. I'd left that morning, before the sun was up, the house sold in a cash deal I'd closed weeks ago. Locks changed, keys tossed, a realtor's sign staked in the yard like a flag of surrender. I didn't need it anymore, not the hardwood I'd sanded, not the walls I'd painted, not the life I'd built for her. Let it go to some young couple who'd never know the ghost in its corners. Back there, Lydia would have pulled up to the curb by now, tires crunching gravel, her breath catching at that sign, for sale, sold. The key wouldn't turn, new locks, cold and unyielding, and she'd bang on the door, frantic, her fists echoing in the empty foyer. A neighbor, old Mrs. Carter with her yapping terrier, would poke her head out. "Oh, Mark left this morning," she'd say, casual as gossip. Took a suitcase and drove off. Didn't say where. Lydia's panic would peak then, a wild, clawing thing, everything slipping through her fingers, the house, the life, me. She'd tear through her bag, keys jangling, phone shaking in her hand, searching for something to hold on to. That's when she'd find it, my note. I'd left it on the kitchen counter days ago, folded neat, her name in my handwriting. She'd rip it open, the paper crinkling loud in the silence, and read, "You wanted excitement. Enjoy it." 5 words, sharp as a blade, cutting through her defiance, her guilt, her everything. I could see her standing there, frozen, the note trembling in her grip, the weight of it sinking in. Not a taunt, a truth. She'd chased the rush, the glitter, and now she had it. Raw, messy, hers alone. I swirled the whiskey, the ice melting slow, and traced a line on the Boston deal, $2 million, low risk, high yield. My phone stayed silent, no calls, no texts. Claire had orders to block her, Evelyn to stonewall. Lydia was a ghost to me now, just like I was to her. I pictured her in that empty driveway, the note crumpled in her fist, the night pressing down cold and heavy. She'd lost the house, the stability, the man who'd held her world together. And Derek? He'd be alone in that apartment, screaming into a dead phone, his mistress gone, his creditors circling, his lies laid bare. The bar's jukebox kicked on, some old Springsteen tune, gravelly and low, and I leaned back, the whiskey warming my chest. I'd walked away clean, no blood on my hands, no shouts in the dark. Just a signature, a sale, A note. They built their bubble on my dime, and I'd popped it with a flick of my wrist. Lydia wanted a reckoning? She got it, not in a fight, not in tears, but in the quiet ruin of her own making. I finished the glass, the last drop sharp on my tongue, and slid the folder shut. A new city, a new game, a new life. The reckoning wasn't theirs alone, it was mine, too. I'd taken back what was mine, my peace, my power, my name. Let them drown in the wreckage. I was already gone. The cafe was a hole in the wall, tucked between a dry cleaner and a pawn shop, the kind of place you'd miss if you weren't looking. Faded red awning, chipped formica tables, the hum of a coffee grinder chewing through beans older than the waitress pouring it. I liked it, small, unassuming, a speck of nowhere in a city I'd made my escape to. Late afternoon light slanted through the smudged windows, painting the floor in dusty gold, and I sat in the back corner, a black coffee steaming in my hands. The cup was chipped, the brew bitter, but it grounded me. I'd been driving all day, 6 hours, maybe 7, putting miles between me and the wreckage I'd left behind. This was my pause, my breath, before the next move. The bell above the door jangled, sharp and sudden, and I knew it was her before I looked up. Lydia. Her shadow stretched long across the tiles, wild hair catching the light like a storm cloud, her steps unsteady but determined. She tracked me down. Claire must have slipped. A tip dropped in a moment of pity. I didn't flinch. I'd expected this, maybe even wanted it. One last chance to see her face when the truth sank in. I took a sip of coffee, slow and deliberate, the heat biting my tongue, and watched her close the gap. She looked like hell. Mascara smudged under her eyes, lips chapped, her designer coat wrinkled like she'd slept in it. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of my table, nails chipped, knuckles white. "Mark," she said, voice shaking, a crack running through it like thin ice. "You can't just disappear like this. What the hell did you do?" Her words spilled out fast, accusatory, her breath hitching as she loomed over me, a mess of fury and fear. I set the cup down, the clink loud in the quiet cafe, and leaned back in the chair, its metal frame creaking under me. "Sit," I said, calm as stone, nodding to the seat across from me. She didn't move, just stared, chest heaving. So I met her eyes, steady, unblinking. "You found me. Say what you came to say." My voice was low, even, a tether in the storm she'd brought with her. The waitress glanced over, then away, smart enough to keep her distance. "You're cruel," she spat, her hands slamming the table, rattling the sugar shaker. "You tore everything apart. My home, my life. Because of what? Jealousy? Some sick game." Her voice rose, cracking on the last word, drawing a flicker of attention from the guy nursing a beer 2 tables over. "You sold the house, Mark. Changed the locks. Left me with nothing. How could you?" I adjusted my glasses, the frames cool against my fingers, and let her words hang there, heavy and jagged. She wanted a fight, an explosion, something to match the chaos she'd built with Derek. But that's not how I play. "Cruel?" I said, tilting my head, the faintest edge creeping into my tone. "No, Lydia. I didn't ruin you. You chose your path. I just let you walk it." She blinked, caught off guard, and I leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice dropping lower. "You picked him. You climbed into his bed, laughed in my face, and thought I'd just take it. Tell me, where's the cruelty in giving you what you wanted?" Her mouth opened, then shut, a fish gasping for air. I could see the gears turning, her pride wrestling with the truth I'd laid bare. "You funded him," she said, quieter now, almost a whisper, like saying it aloud made it real. "You set him up, set us up, just to watch us fall." Her eyes narrowed, searching mine for a crack, a flinch, anything to prove she still knew me. She didn't. I nodded, slow, deliberate. "I did. A year ago, I handed Derek his big idea, a shiny lure to see if you'd bite. You did. I poured the money in, kept him afloat, watched him strut around with my cash and my wife. It was a test, Lydia. You failed." My words were a blade, clean and sharp, cutting through her defiance. "I gave you both enough rope, and you hung yourselves. Last night, when he smirked and you stammered, that was the line. I cut the cord. Simple as that." She sank into the chair then, legs giving out, her coat pooling around her like spilled ink. "You could have stopped me," she said, voice small, pleading now. "You could have fought for us, Mark. Why didn't you? A tear streaked down her cheek, carving a path through the mess of her makeup. And for a second, I remembered her laugh, bright, years ago, before the restlessness took root. But that was gone. Fight, I said, a dry laugh slipping out, bitter as the coffee. I don't beg, Lydia. I don't chase. You made your choice, and I made mine. I didn't ruin you. You picked him. And he wasn't man enough to keep it together. That line landed like a punch, her flinch visible, her hands curling into fists on the table. I leaned back, the chair scraping the floor, and watched it sink in. Derek's collapse, his lies, his weakness, all hers now. Please, she said, barely a whisper, reaching for my hand. Mark, we can fix this. I was wrong. I see it now. Give me another chance. Her fingers brushed mine, cold and trembling, a ghost of the woman I'd married. I pulled back, slow, deliberate, and stood, the table rocking slightly as I rose. There's nothing left to fix, I said, my voice flat, final. You wanted excitement. You got it. Live with it. I grabbed my coat from the chair, slung it over my arm, and turned for the door. Her sob broke the silence, raw, jagged, a sound I'd never heard from her before, but I didn't look back. The bell jangled again as I stepped out, the late afternoon air hitting me sharp and cold, the city buzzing beyond the glass. She sat there, alone, pride in tatters, my words echoing in her head. I'd laid it all bare, my long game, her betrayal, the endgame I'd played to perfection. She'd tracked me down for a fight, a lifeline, but I'd given her the truth instead. The pavement crunched under my shoes as I walked away, the cafe fading into the dusk, her shadow swallowed by the light. I was done, free, untethered, a man who'd reclaimed his own. Days had passed since I walked out of that cafe, leaving Lydia's sobs behind me like a fading echo. I didn't need to see the fallout to know it was happening, didn't need to hear the crash to feel the ground shake. I'd built the machine, set it spinning, and now it was chewing through their lives, relentless and precise. I was miles away by then, holed up in a new city. Could have been Columbus, could have been anywhere. Sitting in a rented loft with bare walls and a view of a river I didn't bother naming. My laptop glowed on the table, a spreadsheet of fresh deals humming with possibility, but my mind kept drifting back. Not out of guilt, out of curiosity. What did it look like when the dust settled? Derek's apartment would be a war zone by now, trashed and hollow, a fitting tomb for his dead startup. I could see it clear as day. Pizza boxes piled on the counter, empty beer bottles rolling across the floor, the stench of sweat and failure thick in the air. Connect's fear was gone, wiped out in 72 hours flat. Reporters had swarmed him like flies on a carcass, banging on his door day and night, shouting questions through the mail slot. Grayson, how'd you lose $1 million overnight? What's next for the future of Connection? He'd tried to dodge them at first, I bet, shoving past with a hoodie up, muttering no comment. But they'd camped out, relentless, their cameras flashing like gunfire. Inside, he'd be pacing that cramped space, phone clutched in a sweaty hand, scrolling through a graveyard of missed calls. Creditors were suing now, banks, vendors, the guy who leased him that glass office, all clawing for pieces of a corpse that'd never pay out. His friends, the hangers-on who'd toasted his every pitch, had vanished, their numbers disconnected, their excuses thin. I'd seen his type before, all shine, no spine. When the money dried up, so did the crowd, leaving him alone with the mess he'd made. Lydia would still be there, though. Trapped in his orbit, not out of loyalty, but inertia. I could picture her on that sagging couch, arms crossed, staring at the peeling paint while he begged. You've got something left, right? He'd say, voice high and frantic, pacing closer. Mark's money. He can't have taken it all. Help me out here, babe, just enough to get me back on my feet. She'd laugh then, a bitter, hollow sound, because she had nothing. I'd made sure of that. My assets were locked tight, offshore accounts, trusts she couldn't touch, and that prenup she'd signed 8 years ago, skimming it over coffee with a shrug, was ironclad. She was broke, her designer bags worthless, her credit cards maxed. He'd grab her arm, desperate. Come on, we're a team. But she'd see it then. He was a shell, a hollowed-out husk clinging to her like she was his last lifeline. I leaned back in my chair, the loft's hardwood creaking under me, and took a sip of water, clear, cold, a stark contrast to the whiskey I'd nursed nights before. I didn't need to be there to know how it played out. Lydia's mind would drift, pulled back to the years she'd spent dismissing me. Flashback to a quiet night, maybe 3 years ago. Me in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, stirring a pot of risotto while she scrolled her phone, barely glancing at the plate I set down. "Looks good," she'd mutter, distracted, chasing Derek's latest post. Some rooftop party, all lights and noise. Or that trip to Maine I'd planned. Lobster boats, foggy cliffs. She'd sighed through it, texting him under the table while I watched the waves alone. I'd been steady, solid, building her a life she'd traded for his flash, his empty promises. Back in that apartment, she'd stand, slow and stiff, the couch springs groaning as she broke free. Derek would lunge, voice cracking. "Where you going? You can't leave me like this." But she'd shake him off, her steps heavy on the warped floor, heading for the door. "I'm done," she'd say, flat and final, the words a guillotine dropping on whatever they'd had. He'd yell after her curses, please, a child's tantrum, but she'd keep walking, the door slamming shut with a thud that'd echo in his empty skull. For the first time, she'd be alone, not tethered to me, not chained to him, just her and the wreckage she'd chosen. I set the glass down, the faint clink cutting through the loft's silence, and pictured her stepping into the night, streetlights flickering, air cold enough to sting. She'd find a cheap motel, maybe, one with buzzing neon and stained carpets, and collapse on a lumpy bed, the weight of it all pressing down. Then she'd catch her reflection in the clouded mirror, hair tangled, eyes sunken, a stranger staring back. That was the moment, the key moment, when it had hit her. She wasn't the victim, wasn't the prize, she was the architect of her own ruin. Every choice, every step away from me and toward him, had led her here. No one to blame but the woman in the glass. Derek would be alone too, curled up in that trashed apartment, the reporters gone, the creditors circling, his phone dead. He'd mutter to himself, "I'll bounce back. I always do." But the mirror would show a different story, a hollow shell, a man who'd gambled big and lost bigger. I'd given him the stage, the spotlight, and he'd tripped over his own feet, dragging her down with him. I stood, crossed to the loft's window, and looked out at the river, dark, slow, cutting through the city like a scar. My laptop pinged, a new email, Boston deal moving forward, but I let it sit. The fallout was complete, the pieces scattered, and I was untouched, untangled, a man who'd walked away clean. Lydia saw it now, staring at that reflection, the life she'd had, the one she'd thrown away. Derek saw it too, in the silence of his ruin. Me? I saw a blank slate, a new game, and the quiet thrill of knowing I'd won without firing a shot. The highway stretched out before me like a ribbon unspooling into the dusk, asphalt humming under the tires, the world blurring past in streaks of gold and shadow. My hands rested easy on the wheel, leather warm from the day's drive, steady as ever, guiding the car through a landscape I didn't need to name. Could have been Ohio, could have been Pennsylvania, didn't matter. I'd left the map behind, along with everything else, and the open road felt like a baptism, clean, endless mine. The sky was bleeding red now, the sun dipping low, painting the horizon in shades I hadn't stopped to notice in years. A faint smile tugged at my lips, breaking through the stoic mask I'd worn so long it had become second skin. I didn't fight it. I'd earned this. The car was a rental, sleek, black, anonymous, just enough to carry me from the loft to wherever I landed next. My briefcase sat on the passenger seat, leather creased and familiar, stuffed with papers for a new life. Clean energy deals, a condo in Boston, a fresh slate. The weight of Lydia and Derek was gone, shed like a coat I'd outgrown, left in the dust of a city I'd never see again. My wealth was intact, millions tucked safe in accounts they'd never touch, my dignity reclaimed, polished to a quiet shine. I'd walk through their fire and come out unscathed, a man who'd played the game and won without raising a fist. The radio crackled to life as I fiddled with the dial, static giving way to a news report, the anchor's voice crisp and clipped. And in tech news, Connect's fear, once touted as the next big thing, has officially folded. Founder Derek Grayson faces lawsuits from creditors and a storm of backlash after reports of mismanagement and falsified demos surfaced. Sources say, I turned it off, the knob clicking sharp in the silence, cutting the story dead. I didn't need to hear the rest. I'd written the ending days ago, signed it with a pen stroke, sealed it with a note. Derek's collapse was a footnote now, a whisper on the wind, and I had no room for echoes. I pressed the gas, the engine purring low, and let the miles roll by, fields fading into dusk, silos looming like sentinels, the occasional truck rumbling past with a Doppler growl. My mind drifted, not back, but sideways, to the contrast I knew was unfolding behind me. Lydia, holed up in some cheap motel off the interstate, the kind with flickering neon and a clerk who didn't ask questions. I could see her there, sitting on a sagging bed, the springs whining under her weight, her phone's blue glow lighting up her face. She'd be scrolling job listings, waitress gigs, temp work, anything to claw her way out of the hole she'd dug. Her designer bags, once her pride, would be gone, sold off on consignment for pennies, their leather traded for a night's rent and a tank of gas. I pictured her room, peeling wallpaper, a chipped sink, the hum of a vending machine outside her door. She'd be alone, hair pulled back sloppy, wearing the same clothes she'd stormed out in, the last threads of her old life unraveling. No Derek to cling to, no me to catch her. Just her and the wreckage she'd built, brick by foolish brick. She'd stare at that phone, thumb hovering over a listing. Barista, $12 per hour, no experience needed. And feel the weight of it. Hubris turned to ash, betrayal turned to solitude. A cautionary tale, etched in the lines of her face. A story she'd tell herself every night in that dim, stale room. The highway curved, dipping into a valley where the lights softened, the air rushing through the cracked window cool and sharp against my skin. I'd given her everything once. Dinners I'd cooked, trips I'd planned, a home I'd sanded and painted with my own hands. She'd tossed it for Derek's flash, his hollow shine, and now she sat in the dark with nothing but her choices. I didn't pity her. I didn't hate her. I just didn't care, not anymore. She'd wanted the thrill, the edge, and I'd let her have it, stepping back to watch her fall. It was her ending, not mine. A deer darted across the road ahead, a blur of brown and white, and I eased off the gas, tires whispering against the pavement as it vanished into the trees. The silence settled back in, thick and calm, broken only by the steady thrum of the engine. I glanced at the sunset, red fading to purple, stars pricking through the haze, and felt the last knot in my chest unwind. I was free, untethered, a man who'd shed the past like a snake sheds skin. No anger, no regret, just the road ahead, wide and open, leading me wherever I chose. My phone buzzed in the console, Evelyn, probably, with an update on the Boston deal, but I let it sit, the vibration fading into the hum of the drive. I didn't need to check it yet. The game was mine now, the pieces mine to place, and I'd play it on my terms. Lydia and Derek were ghosts, shadows shrinking in the rearview, their story done. Mine was just beginning, a quiet triumph, a life reclaimed, a victory won not with shouts or fists but with the simplest move of all. I adjusted my grip on the wheel, the leather creaking under my fingers, and let that faint smile linger. The thought came clear, final, as the last light bled from the sky. I didn't need to fight. I just needed to walk away. It was the truth, sharp and clean, a blade I'd wielded without drawing blood. The highway stretched on, dusk deepening to night, and I drove into it, steady, sure, a man who'd found his peace in the leaving. And that's where the road splits, mine stretching into the dusk, hers looping back to the wreckage. What about you? Where's your highway leading? I walked away, reclaimed what was mine, but maybe you've got a story brewing, betrayal you've outsmarted, a choice you've yet to make. Drop it in the comments wherever you're listening and hit that subscribe button to catch the next tale. This one's done, but the road's always open for more. What's your move? See you soon.